It was a warm spring evening in a quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind where kids usually played until their parents called them home for dinner. The streetlights had just flickered on, casting long shadows across the small community playground. The metal chains of the swings creaked gently in the breeze, while a few scattered leaves danced across the empty basketball court. Officer Chen had been on patrol for almost 6 hours when the call came in. Possible trespassing at Riverside Park Playground. The dispatcher's voice crackled through his radio. Caller reports several juveniles on the premises after hours. He sighed, turning his patrol car around. These kinds of calls were common, usually just kids losing track of time. As he pulled up to the park, his headlights swept across the playground equipment. Most of the children scattered like startled birds, their backpacks bouncing against their backs as they ran. But one small figure remained, perched on a swing, her head bent over what appeared to be a book. Her braided hair caught the gleam of his headlights as she looked up, squinting at the sudden brightness. The girl couldn't have been more than 9 or 10 years old. She wore a bright yellow sweater with rainbow buttons, and her sparkly sneakers barely touched the ground beneath the swing. A worn Harry Potter book lay open on her lap, and a small purple backpack rested against the swing's post. Officer Chen stepped out of his car, his boots crunching on the gravel. The playground rules clearly stated it closed at sunset, and the sun had dipped below the horizon at least 20 minutes ago. He'd handled hundreds of similar situations before. Usually a quick word with the kids and their parents was all it took. But something was different tonight. Maybe it was the pressure from his recent performance review, or the stern words from his supervisor about being too lenient. Whatever the reason, Officer Chen approached with an unusually stern demeanor, his hand resting on his belt in what he later realized was an unnecessarily intimidating pose. "Hey, you can't be here," he called out, his voice sharper than the situation warranted. The playground's closed. The girl looked up from her book, her expression shifting from confusion to worry as she noted his aggressive stance. "But I live right there," she said softly, pointing to a well-kept 2-story house across the street. "I always read here after finishing my homework." Her voice trembled slightly, but she spoke clearly and respectfully. Instead of verifying her story or asking for her parents' contact information, Officer Chen made a decision that would change multiple lives in the next few minutes. "Stand up," he ordered, pulling out his handcuffs. "Put your hands behind your back." The girl's book tumbled from her lap, landing face down in the wood chips below. Her lower lip quivered as she stood, her small frame shaking. "Please," she whispered, "I just want to go home. My dad." "You can explain everything down at the station." Officer Chen cut her off, the cold metal of the handcuffs clicking shut around her tiny wrists. He didn't notice the curtains moving in the house across the street, or the frantic phone call being made by a watching neighbor. As he led the frightened child to his patrol car, Officer Chen was following procedure to the letter, and breaking every principle of human decency and common sense. He had no idea that in the next 7 minutes, his entire world would turn upside down, and he'd learned the hardest lesson of his career in the most public way possible. The patrol car's interior light illuminated the girl's face as she sat in the back seat, a single tear rolling down her cheek. She wasn't screaming or fighting, just sitting there with a dignity that would later haunt Officer Chen's memories. As he reached for his computer to run her information, the radio crackled to life, and everything was about to change. Officer Chen's fingers hovered over his laptop keyboard as he prepared to enter the girl's information. The screen's blue glow lit up his face in the darkening evening, while the soft sound of sniffling came from the back seat. He hadn't even asked for her name yet, another procedure he'd rushed past in his haste to assert authority. "What's your name?" he asked, his tone still carrying that unnecessary edge. The girl looked up, her eyes meeting his in the rearview mirror. Even through his misplaced sternness, something about her calm, steady gaze made him slightly uncomfortable. "My name is Lily," she replied quietly. "I'm 9 years old, and my daddy says I should always tell the truth to police officers." Her voice carried no anger, just a hint of confusion and fear that made Officer Chen's stomach twist slightly. As he began typing her information into the system, he noticed his hands were trembling slightly. Why was he so worked up over a kid reading in a park? The question nagged at the back of his mind, but he pushed it away, focusing instead on following procedures he convinced himself were necessary. "Date of birth?" he asked, trying to maintain his authoritative tone. Laylee recited it clearly, along with her address, the same house she'd pointed to earlier. Officer Chen's fingers moved automatically across the keyboard, entering the information that would soon change everything. The crickets chirped in the growing darkness, and a cool breeze rustled through the trees. It was such a peaceful evening, making the absurdity of the situation even more striking. A 9-year-old girl in handcuffs for reading Harry Potter in a park across from her own home. That's when the first warning bell should have rung in Officer Chen's mind. But he was too caught up in his own authority, too focused on proving something. Though what exactly, he couldn't have said. He'd stopped thinking like a protector of the community and started acting like something else entirely. "Last name?" he asked, his finger poised over the keyboard. Laylee's response came clear and steady, and as Officer Chen typed it in, the computer screen suddenly seemed to glow brighter. His eyes widened as the information populated across his screen, and his heart began to race. There it was in plain text. Lily's full name and address, along with her father's information. Her father, who happened to be Police Chief Richards, the first black police chief in the city's history, known for his dedication to community policing and building trust between law enforcement and neighborhoods. Officer Chen's hand froze above the keyboard. The reality of what he'd done hit him like a physical blow. He'd just handcuffed the police chief's daughter, a 9-year-old girl who had been doing nothing wrong except reading a book near her own home. Sweat began to be on his forehead despite the cool evening air. His mind raced through the last 15 minutes, replaying every mistake, every skipped procedure, every ignored opportunity to handle this situation differently. He hadn't called for her parents, hadn't verified her story, hadn't even bothered to look at the house she pointed to, a house he now realized he'd driven past hundreds of times on patrol. The radio crackled suddenly, making him jump. "Unit 247, be advised, Chief Richards is en route to your location." The dispatcher's voice was professional, but carried an undertone that made Officer Chen's blood run cold. He glanced again in the rear-view mirror. Lily sat quietly, her small hands still bound behind her back, her book abandoned in the playground wood chips. She didn't look angry or scared anymore, just disappointed, in a way that made Officer Chen's chest tighten with shame. In the distance, he could hear the approaching sirens. His breathing became shallow as panic started to set in. What had he done? How could he possibly explain this? The sound of car doors slamming nearby told him he was about to find out, and the next few minutes would be the longest of his career. The sound of approaching footsteps on gravel seemed to echo in Officer Chen's ears. Through his side mirror, he could see a tall figure striding purposefully toward the patrol car, followed by several other officers. The police chief was still in his formal uniform, likely having come straight from an evening meeting at City Hall. Officer Chen's hands shook as he fumbled with his seatbelt. Should he get out? Stay in the car? His training hadn't prepared him for this moment. The decision was made for him when a sharp knock rattled his driver's side window. "Step out of the vehicle, officer." The chief's voice was calm, too calm. It was the kind of calm that came before a storm. Officer Chen pushed his door open slowly, his legs feeling like jelly as he stood to face his superior. Chief Richards stood there, an imposing figure in his crisp uniform, his badge catching the glow of the streetlights. But it wasn't the chief's authority that made Officer Chen's stomach drop. It was the look in the man's eyes when they flickered to the back seat of the patrol car, where his daughter sat handcuffed. Keys, the chief said simply, extending his hand. Officer Chen fumbled with his handcuff keys, nearly dropping them before placing them in the chief's palm. The gathered officers watched in complete silence as Chief Richards opened the back door of the patrol car. "Hi, Daddy," Lily's soft voice carried in the quiet night air. The chief's hand trembled slightly as he unlocked the handcuffs. The metal clinks seemed impossibly loud in the tense silence. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" Chief Richards asked, his voice gentle as he helped his daughter out of the car. The contrast between how he spoke to his child and the rigid authority he projected toward Officer Chen was striking. "I'm okay," Lily replied, rubbing her wrists. "I was just reading Harry Potter, like I always do." She looked up at her father, then over at Officer Chen. "I tried to tell him I live right there." The chief picked up his daughter's purple backpack from the car floor, then turned to face Officer Chen. The look in his eyes made the young officer take an involuntary step backward. "Officer Chen," the chief began, his voice still unnaturally steady, "please explain to me why my 9-year-old daughter was placed in handcuffs while reading a book across the street from our house." Officer Chen opened his mouth, but no words came out. How could he explain something he himself was starting to realize had no reasonable explanation? The silence stretched on, broken only by the distant sound of a dog barking and the gentle creaking of the abandoned swing where Lily had been sitting. Officer Chen's voice cracked. He cleared his throat and tried again. "Sir, I received a call about trespassing after hours." Even as he said it, the words sounded hollow and inadequate. "And did you verify her address?" The chief's questions came steady and methodical. "Did you attempt to contact her parents? Did you follow any of the department's protocols for dealing with minors?" Each question hit like a physical blow. Officer Chen felt the eyes of every officer present boring into him. His chest tightened as the full weight of his actions pressed down on him. "No, sir," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Daddy," Lily tugged at her father's sleeve. "My book is still over there." She pointed to the playground where her Harry Potter book lay face down in the wood chips, its pages ruffling in the evening breeze. The chief looked at his daughter, then back at Officer Chen. "Go get my daughter's book," he ordered. It wasn't just a command to retrieve a book. It was a walk of shame, and everyone present knew it. As Officer Chen walked the seemingly endless distance to the playground, his footsteps heavy, he could hear the chief quietly consoling his daughter. His vision blurred with tears of shame and regret. He bent down to pick up the book, and as he straightened up, he realized this night would change not just his career, but his entire perspective on what it meant to wear the badge. Officer Chen's walk back to the patrol car felt like moving through quicksand. The Harry Potter book weighed heavily in his hands, its pages still warm from where Lily had been holding it. The gathering of officers had grown larger. Word traveled fast in the department, and this wasn't just any incident. The chief stood with one hand on his daughter's shoulder, his other hand holding her purple backpack. His face was a study in controlled emotions, a father's pain warring with a police chief's professional restraint. As Officer Chen approached, he could see the chief's jaw clenching and unclenching. "Your book, sweetheart," Chief Richards said softly, taking the book from Officer Chen and handing it to Lily. She hugged it to her chest like a shield. The sight made Officer Chen's throat tighten. He had turned a child's safe space into a source of trauma. "Lieutenant Parker," the chief called out, and a senior officer stepped forward from the gathered group. "I'd want Officer Chen's body camera footage pulled immediately. Get the playground security cameras too." His voice remained steady, but there was steel beneath the calm. Officer Chen felt the cold sweat running down his back. Every moment of his poor decisions would be reviewed, analyzed, and judged. The footage wouldn't lie. It would show exactly how he'd approached a reading child with unnecessary aggression, how he'd ignored her reasonable explanations, how he jumped straight to handcuffs without following any proper procedures. "Chief, Officer Chen started to speak, but the chief held up his hand. "Not here," Chief Richards said firmly. "Not in front of my daughter." He turned to Lily, his expression softening. "Sweetheart, Mom's waiting at home. Officer Thompson will walk you across the street." A female officer stepped forward, smiling warmly at Lily. As they walked away, Lily looked back over her shoulder, not at Officer Chen, but at her father. The concern in her young eyes spoke volumes. Even at 9, she understood something significant was happening. Once Lily was safely out of earshot, Chief Richards turned back to Officer Chen. The professional mask slipped just slightly, allowing a glimpse of the father's pain and anger underneath. "2 questions, Officer Chen," the chief said, his voice barely above a whisper. "First, if she wasn't black, would you have put her in handcuffs? Second, if she wasn't a child, would you have listened when she tried to explain?" The questions hung in the air like physical things. Officer Chen felt his legs growing weak. He wanted to defend himself, to explain his actions, but the chief's questions stripped away every possible excuse. The truth was unbearable. He had acted on unconscious bias, and a child had paid the price. Officer Chen's voice cracked. "Sir, I never meant." "Intent isn't enough," the chief cut him off. "Not anymore. Not in this department. Not in this city." He gestured to the gathered officers. "Everyone here tonight is watching how we handle this. Every parent in this city will be watching. Every child will be watching." The weight of those words pressed down on Officer Chen's shoulders. He thought about his own nephew, about how he'd feel if someone had treated him this way. The realization of what he'd done, really done, hit him full force. "My office, first thing tomorrow morning," the chief continued. "For now, you're relieved of duty. Turn in your badge and gun to Lieutenant Parker." The chief's voice softened slightly. "And Officer Chen, take this time to think about why you became a police officer in the first place." As Officer Chen unbuckled his gun belt with trembling hands, he caught sight of Lily entering her house across the street. The porch light illuminated her small figure for a moment before she disappeared inside. The same porch light he'd driven past countless times on patrol, never thinking about the lives and stories behind it. The night air felt heavy with the weight of consequences about to unfold, and Officer Chen realized that the next few hours of sitting alone with his thoughts might be the most important lesson of his career. After handing over his badge and gun, Officer Chen sat alone in his personal car, still parked near the playground. The other officers had dispersed, leaving him with nothing but the echo of his thoughts and the soft ticking of his cooling engine. His uniform felt too tight, too heavy, a weight of responsibility he failed to honor. Through his windshield, he could see Lily's house. The porch light was still on, casting a warm glow that seemed to mock the coldness of his actions. Upstairs, a shadow moved across a lit window, probably the chief talking to his daughter, trying to explain why a police officer had treated her that way. How do you explain something like that to a child? His hands gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. The tears he'd been holding back finally broke free, rolling down his cheeks in hot streams of shame. He remembered his academy graduation day, standing proud as his mother pinned on his badge, promising to protect and serve everyone in the community. Everyone, not just the people who looked like him. A sudden tap on his window made him jump. Lieutenant Parker stood outside, holding a tissue box. Chen quickly wiped his eyes and rolled down the window. "Take it," the lieutenant said, offering the box. "You're going to need it." Her voice wasn't unkind, but it carried the weight of experience. "I've been on the force 20 years, and I've seen good officers make bad decisions. But what matters now is what you do next." Chen took the tissue box with trembling hands. I don't know what to do," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "How do I fix this?" The lieutenant leaned against his car door, looking thoughtfully at the playground. "Start by asking yourself why. Why didn't you just walk across the street to verify her story? Why didn't you call her parents? Why did you see a threat in a little girl reading Harry Potter? Each question hit harder than the last. Chen stared at his hands on the steering wheel. Hands that had put handcuffs on a child who was just trying to enjoy a book. The reality of his actions crashed over him in waves. I keep seeing her face, he choked out. The way she looked at me when I put those handcuffs on her. She wasn't even scared at first. She was confused. Like she couldn't understand why this was happening to her. That's good, the lieutenant said firmly. Hold on to that feeling. Let it change you. A police cruiser drove by slowly, its headlights sweeping across them. Chen caught a glimpse of his reflection in the rearview mirror, his eyes red, his face streaked with tears. He hardly recognized himself. The chief, Chen started, then had to clear his throat. The chief asked me if I would have done the same thing if she wasn't black. I can't. I can't answer that question. I don't want to know the answer. But you do know, the lieutenant said quietly. That's why you're crying. That's why this hurts so much. Because deep down, you know the truth. Chen's shoulders shook as a fresh wave of tears came. The lieutenant stood silently, giving him space to break down. In the distance, a dog barked, and somewhere a car door slammed. Normal neighborhood sounds on what should have been a normal evening. Tomorrow morning's meeting with the chief. Chen finally managed to say, "What should I expect?" The lieutenant straightened up, adjusting her uniform. Expect to face the hardest conversation of your career. Expect to question everything you thought you knew about being a police officer. And expect to make a choice about what kind of officer, what kind of person you want to be going forward. She turned to leave, then paused. And Chen, remember this feeling. Remember it every time you put on the uniform, if you ever put it on again. Remember the little girl with the Harry Potter book, and let it guide every decision you make. As the lieutenant's footsteps faded away, Chen sat in his car, watching the lights go out one by one in the houses around the playground. Tomorrow would bring consequences, hard conversations, and possibly the end of his career. But tonight, alone in his car, he faced the hardest judge of all, his own conscience. The next morning arrived too quickly. The police station buzzed with unusual tension as Officer Chen walked through the front doors in civilian clothes. The same officers he joked with just yesterday now avoided eye contact, stepping aside as he passed. Their silence spoke volumes. At the front desk, the usually chatty receptionist simply pointed toward the chief's office. News had spread fast, not just within the department, but across the city. Chen had made the mistake of checking his phone that morning. Social media was already exploding with video clips from nearby home security cameras showing him handcuffing Lily. The walk to the chief's office felt like walking to his own execution. Each step echoed in the hallway. Through the glass walls of the conference room, he could see Lieutenant Parker and several other high-ranking officers reviewing what looked like body camera footage. His body camera footage. The chief's secretary didn't even look up. "Go right in," she said flatly. Chen's hand trembled as he reached for the door handle. Inside, Chief Richards sat behind his desk, looking like he hadn't slept. Multiple monitors displayed freeze frames from last night's incident. On his desk lay a thick folder, Chen's personnel file, and beside it, heartbreakingly, Lily's Harry Potter book. "Sit down," the chief said quietly. Chen sank into the chair, his legs feeling weak. The chief picked up the book, turning it over in his hands. She couldn't sleep last night. Kept asking if she did something wrong. If she's not allowed to read anymore. Chen's throat tightened. He wanted to apologize, but what words could possibly be enough? "My wife spent 2 hours convincing her it's still safe to sit on our own porch," the chief continued, his voice steady but lined with pain. "Do you understand what you did last night, Officer Chen? Not just to my daughter, but to every child who looks like her." The chief pressed a button on his computer, and Chen's body camera footage began playing on one of the monitors. The scene unfolded in harsh clarity. His aggressive approach, Lily's confused responses, the unnecessary escalation. Watching it now, Chen could hardly believe his own actions. "Stop," Chen whispered. "Please. I can't." "You can't watch it." The chief's voice sharpened. "My daughter lived it. The least you can do is watch it." The footage continued playing. Every mistake, every skipped procedure, every ignored opportunity to handle things differently. All preserved in high definition. Chen's hands gripped the arms of his chair as he forced himself to watch. "Internal Affairs will conduct a full investigation," the chief said when the video ended. "But I'm more interested in what happens next. Tell me, Officer Chen, why did you become a police officer?" The question caught Chen off guard. He'd expected anger, punishment, maybe even firing. Not this. I wanted to help people," he said softly, "to protect them." "And who exactly did you protect last night?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Chen had no answer. "Here's what's going to happen," the chief continued. "You're suspended for 30 days without pay. During that time, you'll complete our department's new bias training program. You'll also volunteer at the community center's after-school reading program, the same one my daughter attends." Chen looked up, surprised. "Sir? You need to see these kids as children first, Officer Chen. Not as threats, not as statistics. As children who deserve to read books in parks without fear of being handcuffed." The chief stood up, walking to his office window. Outside, life went on. People walking to work, kids heading to school, the community they were sworn to protect and serve. "One more thing," the chief said, turning back. "My daughter has this tradition of baking cookies for someone when they've had a bad day. She insisted on baking some for you last night." He pulled out a small paper bag and placed it on the desk. Chen stared at it, feeling tears well up again. The simple kindness of a child he had wronged cut deeper than any punishment could. "That's the kind of heart we need in our officers," the chief said quietly. "That's what you need to find in yourself again. Now get out of my office and start proving you deserve to wear that badge again." Chen stood on shaky legs, picking up the cookie bag. As he reached the door, the chief spoke one last time. "And Officer Chen, don't you dare waste this second chance." 2 weeks into his suspension, Officer Chen stood nervously outside the community center's bright yellow doors. Inside, children's laughter echoed through the halls. The after-school reading program was in full swing. The paper bag of Lily's cookies, still untouched, sat in his car's glove compartment. He hadn't been able to bring himself to eat them yet. The bias training sessions had been eye-opening and uncomfortable. Hour after hour of confronting his own prejudices, watching case studies, and learning about the devastating impact of snap judgments. But this, walking into a room full of children who might have seen the viral video of him handcuffing one of their friends, this felt harder than any training. "You must be Officer Chen," a warm voice called out. The program coordinator, Mrs. B, walked toward him with a welcoming smile. Her gray hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and reading glasses hung from a chain around her neck. "We've been expecting you." Chen swallowed hard. "I'm not sure I should be here," he admitted quietly. Mrs. B's eyes softened. "That's exactly why you should be," she said, gently taking his arm. "Come on, the kids are just starting their reading circle." She led him into a colorful room filled with beanbag chairs and bookshelves. About 15 children sat in a circle, each holding a book. Chen's heart stopped when he spotted Lily among them, clutching a different Harry Potter book than the one from that night. The children looked up as they entered. Some whispered to each other, recognition dawning in their eyes. Chen felt his face grow hot with shame. "Everyone," Mrs. B announced cheerfully, "this is Officer Chen. He's going to be helping us with our reading program for a while." She turned to him. Why don't you take a seat in that empty beanbag chair? Chen lowered himself into the bright orange beanbag, feeling awkward and out of place in his civilian clothes. A small boy next to him scooted his beanbag away slightly. The gesture wasn't lost on Chen. This was what fear looked like. Today, Mrs. B continued, we're taking turns reading our favorite parts from our books and explaining why we chose them. Lily, would you like to start? Chen's stomach clenched. Of course, Lily would go first. He watched as she opened her book, her small fingers finding the marked page. This is from chapter 3, she began, her voice clear and confident. It's when Harry learns he's a wizard, and he finds out he belongs somewhere. That sometimes people judge you wrong, but that doesn't change who you really are. Chen felt tears pricking at his eyes. The parallel wasn't lost on him, or on any of the adults in the room. Lily continued reading, and gradually, the other children became absorbed in the story, momentarily forgetting their wariness of him. Would she finish? Mrs. B asked. Who would like to read next? The small boy who had moved away from Chen raised his hand. Can Officer Chen read next? He asked hesitantly. I want to know what kind of books he likes. The room fell silent. All eyes turned to Chen, who fumbled in his pocket and pulled out a worn paperback. A copy of To Kill a Mockingbird he'd been reading during his suspension. This book, he started, his voice shaky, is about learning to see people as they really are, not as we assume they are. It's about a man who learns to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard. As he read, Chen noticed the children slowly leaning forward, listening. The boy next to him inched his beanbag chair back to its original position. And Lily was watching him with those same wise eyes that had looked at him through his patrol car mirror. When he finished reading, Mrs. P smiled. Thank you, Officer Chen. Sometimes the best way to learn about each other is through the stories we share. She looked around the circle. Who wants to help Officer Chen pick out some new books to read? Several hands shot up, including, to his surprise, Lily's. As the children led him to the bookshelves, chattering about their favorites, Chen realized something profound. These weren't just kids in a reading program. They were young teachers, giving him a master class in seeing the world through new eyes. As the days of his suspension turned into weeks, Officer Chen's visits to the reading program became the highlight of his days. The children's initial fear had gradually melted into curiosity, then acceptance, and finally friendship. They had become his best teachers, though they didn't know it. Today was different, though. It marked his final mandatory visit to the program, and the knot in his stomach had nothing to do with nervousness anymore. Instead, it was the sadness of saying goodbye to something that had changed him deeply. You're coming back tomorrow, right? Asked Tommy, the little boy who had once moved his beanbag away from Chen. Now he sat cross-legged on the floor next to Chen's chair, a comic book open on his lap. Chen looked around the room at the familiar faces that had become so dear to him. Actually, I have a meeting with the police chief tomorrow about going back to work. The room grew quiet. Even Mrs. B, arranging books on a shelf, paused to listen. Are you going to be different? The question came from Lily, who sat nearby with her ever-present Harry Potter book. Will you put your uniform back on? The simplicity of her question hit him hard. Chen set down the book he'd been holding and leaned forward in his chair. Want to know a secret? He asked, loud enough for everyone to hear. I still have those cookies you baked for me, Lily. They're in my car. She tilted her head, confused. But that was weeks ago. They must be super stale now. They are, Chen admitted. But I keep them to remind me. Every time I look at that bag, I remember that night, and I remember how kindness can come from the most unexpected places. That's kind of weird, Tommy said with a child's honesty, heaping old cookies. A few children giggled, and Chen smiled too. Maybe it is, but sometimes we need weird things to help us remember important lessons. Mrs. B walked over, her reading glasses twinkling in the afternoon light. "Why don't you tell the children what you've learned here? They've been your teachers, after all." Chen looked at the young faces around him, all waiting expectantly. "Well, I learned that books can be bridges," he began. "They help us understand people who seem different from us. I learned that being scared of someone just because they look different is like judging a book by its cover. You miss all the good stuff inside." He reached into his backpack and pulled out several new books. "I also learned that everyone has a story worth hearing. That's why I bought these for the reading program. They're stories about police officers learning to be better, about communities coming together, about seeing past our first impressions." The children crowded around as he showed them the books. Their excitement over new reading material was contagious, and Chen felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Officer Chen." Lily's voice was quiet but clear. "Did you ever eat lunch in your police car?" The question seemed random, but Chen nodded. "Sometimes, when I was busy on patrol." "Maybe," she hesitated, then continued. "Maybe when you go back to work, you could eat lunch here sometimes, and read with us." The other children perked up at this suggestion. "Yeah," Tommy exclaimed. "You could come in your uniform and everything. Show everyone that police officers like books too." Mrs. B smiled warmly. "That's not a bad idea. It might help other officers learn what you've learned." Chen looked around the room, at the colorful beanbag chairs, the well-loved books, the bright drawings on the walls. This place had become more than just a punishment or a learning experience. It had become a sanctuary where change was possible, where fear could turn to understanding. "I'd like that," he said finally, "but only if you promise to tell me when I'm not seeing things clearly. Deal?" "Deal," the children chorused. As the afternoon sun streamed through the windows, casting warm squares of light on the carpet, Chen realized something important. Tomorrow's meeting with the chief wasn't just about getting his badge back. It was about bringing what he'd learned in this room, about empathy, about judgment, about seeing people's true stories, back to the streets he patrolled. And maybe, just maybe, that could make a difference. 1 year later, the playground looked different in the golden afternoon light. Officer Chen sat on a bench, watching kids play while he ate his lunch. He was in full uniform, his badge catching the sunlight. But this wasn't a patrol stop. This was his regular Wednesday routine. A group of children played nearby, their backpacks scattered on the grass. Among them was Lily, now 10, explaining the rules of a new game to some younger kids. She caught his eye and waved, no trace of fear in her gesture. How far they'd come from that night 12 months ago. "Looks like you found the best lunch spot in town," a familiar voice said. Chief Richards approached, carrying his own sandwich. "Mind if I join you?" Chen shifted over on the bench, making room. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the children play. The same swings that had once been the scene of his biggest mistake now rang with laughter. "The community feedback reports came in this morning," the chief said, unwrapping his sandwich. "Your name came up several times. Apparently, you've been quite the hit at school career days." Chen smiled, remembering last week's visit to the elementary school. He brought a stack of books along with his badge and uniform. The kids had been more interested in his reading recommendations than his handcuffs. "The reading program changed everything," Chen admitted. "Not just how I see the community, but how they see me. Yesterday, a mom thanked me for recommending Harry Potter to her son. Can you believe that? A year ago, I was the officer who handcuffed a little girl for reading it." The chief nodded thoughtfully. "Speaking of which, there's something I want to show you." He pulled out his phone, opened a video, and handed it to Chen. The video showed Lily standing at a podium in what looked like the city council chamber. She was speaking clearly and confidently. "I want to talk about how one scary night turned into something good. The officer who put handcuffs on me for reading. He now reads books with kids every week. He taught me that people can learn and change. And he taught other police officers that kids who look like me are just kids who like to read. Chen felt tears welling up. The chief pretended not to notice. She gave that speech last night at the council meeting, the chief explained. They were discussing funding for a new program, having police officers volunteer at libraries and schools. The council approved it unanimously. A shout of laughter drew their attention back to the playground. Tommy, who had become a regular at the reading program, was showing some other kids a new book. Chen recognized it as one he'd recommended last week. You know what the best part is? Chen said softly. These kids, they don't see me as just a uniform anymore. And I don't see them as just faces on the street. We're all just people, sharing stories. The chief stood up, brushing crumbs from his uniform. That night a year ago, I was ready to end your career, he admitted. But sometimes our worst mistakes lead to our best changes. You proved that. As if on cue, several children ran up to them, including Lily and Tommy. Officer Chen, are you coming to reading circle today? Tommy asked excitedly. I finished the book you gave me. Wouldn't miss it, Chen smiled. He glanced at his watch. In fact, we should head over now. As the children gathered their backpacks, the chief put a hand on Chen's shoulder. You know, that old saying about not judging a book by its cover. Turns out it works both ways. Sometimes the cover can change too. Chen watched as Lily picked up her newest Harry Potter book. She was on the last one now. The sight no longer brought him shame, but hope. He stood up, straightening his uniform. Chief, thank you for giving me the chance to rewrite my story. No, the chief replied, watching his daughter chat happily with her friends. Thank you for proving that change isn't just something we talk about. It's something we live. Together, they walked toward the community center, followed by a trail of chattering children. The afternoon sun cast their shadows long across the playground. Shadows that no longer held any fear, just the promise of more stories to come.